In this chapter, we're going to discuss fiscal policy. In the previous chapter, we developed an aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, and in this chapter, we use that aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to discuss fiscal policy, or policy undertaken by the federal government. In general, there's only two things the federal government can do in terms of policy, and that's change taxes or change spending, and those are going to be our fiscal policy tools. There are two types of discretionary fiscal policy. And what I mean by discretionary fiscal policy, the policy we're going to discuss in the beginning is that which has to be voted on by Congress and then implemented. So it is up to Congress to make the decisions, and only the House of Representatives can actually create a budget and spend money. So it has to start there, go through the Senate, and then be signed by the President. Expansionary fiscal policy is undertaken during a recession. And in a recession, what you have technically is you have declining GDP. We're going to look at it slightly differently by simply saying we're below the natural rate. This type of policy consists of either cutting taxes or increasing spending or both, and this should increase the deficit. Contractionary fiscal policy is undertaken during high inflation periods and low unemployment periods. In other words, at this point, we're above the natural rate. This consists of either increasing taxes, reducing spending, or both, and should reduce the deficit and possibly lead to a surplus. In this graph, we can see our typical equilibriums. We're showing a recession. And what I mean here is we see the standard aggregate supply curve. We see AD1, which is where we are now. That's aggregate demand curve 1, and it is below the natural rate. Well, where we want to be is at the natural rate. So we actually want to shift the aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2. And we're going to discuss exactly how we do that beginning in the next slide. In this above graph, you'll notice the equilibrium level of outputs below the natural rate or the full employment rate. We're using those interchangeably, and this is defined as a recession. This natural rate, if determined by policymakers, is based on the rate of unemployment that will not make the inflation rate rise or fall. In this case, the federal government has two policy tools to move us from AD1 to AD2. They can cut taxes or they can increase spending, and of course they can do some combination of those. This would shift the aggregate demand curve, which we've labeled AD1, to the right to AD2. This shift would increase aggregate demand, increase output, and get us to the natural rate of output. Also, notably, it will, as the economy grows, it's also going to increase tax revenue. How can we shift the AD curve, the aggregate demand curve? As pointed out, we could increase the aggregate demand by cutting taxes or increasing government spending. How much? This would depend on the multiplier. Assume we had an MPC of 0.2. That means our multiplier is 1 over 0.2 or 5. Assume we needed to increase aggregate demand by $500 billion. Then we would need to increase G by 500 billion divided by 5, or $100 billion. In the previous slide, we showed the impact of increasing government spending on aggregate demand using the multiplier. What about cutting taxes? Well, we normally assume a cut in taxes will increase aggregate demand, but not as much. This is due to the fact that a cut in taxes reduces the multiplier, since not all of it will be consumed, some of it will be saved. In other words, what it's really doing is reducing the size of the multiplier a bit. Thus, a $100 billion decrease in taxes will only increase consumption by $80 billion. Why? Because of the MPC of 0.8. In other words, if we cut taxes by $100 billion, then we multiply the $100 billion times the MPC, and this is going to only give us an increase in consumption of $80 billion. If we multiply that $80 billion times 5, that will give us an increase of only $400 billion in aggregate demand. Thus, the tax decrease will need to be larger than the increase in spending. Since a $100 billion cut in taxes only increased GDP by $400 billion, this implies a tax multiplier of 4. So we would need to cut taxes by $125 billion to get the same impact, or $500 billion divided by 4. Comment on this, though, as one who is not a profound believer in this type of policy, but does believe it works to some extent. Have to keep in mind this is a simplified model, and it's unclear how well it holds if we move beyond the simple assumptions. There may be other effects we do not measure, such as incentive effects. So to state that tax cuts don't have as big an impact as government spending increases may be a little bit misleading. The other point is that transfer payments are actually treated as a tax. So we will note here that the increase in government spending is going to have more of an impact if it is actually an increase in government consumption. What about contractionary fiscal policy? This is undertaken during periods of very low unemployment and high inflation. In this case, demand is too high and above the natural rate. Remember, we had sort of the twin evils. High unemployment is one evil, high inflation is another. Contractionary policy would reduce inflation rates, would drive up unemployment rates, but what it's going to do, it's only going to drive them to the natural rate. In other words, not the one that's going to stabilize inflation. The next slide will show this. Assume we're at AD1, which is above the natural rate. We want to move to AD2, which means we're going to have to reduce aggregate demand. Notice at that point the price levels have risen. If this continues, we'll continue to see price levels rise. So we want to stabilize price levels and actually get the output level down some. Of course, that's going to raise unemployment, but it's going to raise it to the natural rate. A zero unemployment rate is actually impossible in an economy like ours. Notice in the above graph, AD1 intersects the aggregate supply curve above the natural rate. In order to reduce aggregate demand and bring it back to the natural rate at AD2, the government will need to cut spending or increase taxes. Since the multiplier works in a negative direction as well as a positive direction, the above calculations hold. If we want to cut aggregate demand by $500 billion, we will need to either cut spending by $100 billion or increase taxes by $125 billion. The only difference here is that it's a negative instead of a positive sign. So if you go back to the expansionary calculations, all we're doing is reducing by the same amount as we would increase if the change needs to be $500 billion. So, which is better? Well, based on our model, we get more bang for the buck by increasing government spending, specifically government consumption. Transfer payments, based on our model, will have the same impact as tax cuts since we assume part of the transfer payment is saved. Normally, we assume transfer payments go to low-income individuals, but that simply is not always true. They go to a large variety of people in our economy because transfer payments are so large. On the other hand, tax cuts and tax increases may have incentive or disincentive effects. This we discuss a little later. What about things that we don't need to change but may affect the economy? Well, these are called automatic stabilizers, and they create built-in stability. Sometimes fiscal policy do not need to be enacted, they're simply automatic. One is a progressive income tax. As your income rises, your tax rate rises, so even though you receive a pay increase, some is taxed away and you cannot consume it. On the other hand, if you lose income, your taxes fall and the impact is not as large as the decrease in income. For example, assume you pay 20% in taxes. A $100 increase in pay only gives you an increase in disposable income of $80. If you lose $100 in income, you only lose $80 in disposable income. So what it's doing is it's really reducing the amount of consumption that you can increase with that given increase in income. And so the tax rate to some rate actually creates stability. The other point, and I made this earlier, is that if incomes rise, tax revenues rise, and that's going to reduce the deficit to some extent. The other type of built-in stability is transfer payments. If you lose your job, does your income go to zero? Probably not, because you can obtain unemployment or some other type of transfer payment, such as food stamps. If you get your job back, you then lose these transfer payments. This keeps your consumption from dropping as low as it might have otherwise. So you really never go to zero, but you'll have some support from a myriad of transfer payments as indicated. Here we discuss what we call the cyclically adjusted budget or the full employment budget. Since deficits are expansionary and surpluses are contractionary, what we want is the government budget to be balanced to full employment. In other words, once we hit the natural rate, we don't want any expansionary or contractionary influences on the economy, and a deficit is expansionary, which would continue to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and surpluses are contractionary, which would continue to shift us to the left. As the economy expands, tax revenues will rise. Thus, if we use expansionary policy, as the economy expands, revenues rise and wipe out part of the deficit. Ideally, the deficit reaches zero at full employment. This gives us an idea of how much spending should be with either an expansionary or contractionary budget. We should set the budget at what revenues will be when the economy reaches a natural rate. In that case, when there is a recession, the budget will be in deficit, but when we are above full employment, we'll be in surplus. At full employment, it will be balanced. What are some problems with fiscal policy? Well, there are several, and as we have found over the years, that they do create problems. As I indicated, I'm not sure that fiscal policy is the best way to go. And right now, if you look at the fiscal policy we've undertaken, if you are to accept the fact that we're near the natural rate, which is highly debatable, we should have a balanced budget, but in fact we have a $500 billion deficit. So what are some of the problems of fiscal policy? Well, first of all, lags. In other words, what we mean by this, since they are discretionary policies, it takes time to get them implemented. Milton Friedman, a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, usually by the time that we have enacted proper fiscal policy, it's too late. And there's probably some truth to that. First of all, the first lag is recognition. First of all, you have to recognize the fact that you have a recession. This is a little bit more, or too high a rate of inflation and too low a rate of unemployment. This is much easier said than done, and we often fight for sometimes after a recession to determine exactly when it began. Also, if you use our definition of a recession being two consecutive quarterly declines in GDP, we're going to have to wait 2 quarters before we even recognize that we have a recession. Next, even once you recognize it, now you have to implement policies. These have to go through Congress. Congress isn't always speedy, and so you have an administrative issue too. So we've got to go through the House, we've got to go through the Senate, and we have to get to the President and have it signed. This can take months or sometimes longer. Finally, operational. What happens then? Now you've allocated money or you've changed tax rates or whatever you have done, and now these have to be implemented, and this takes time. If you go back to when Obama was first elected, we showed a very large deficit, and it was well over $1 trillion. But if you looked at the spending plans to fight this recession, they actually spread out over 7 years. Well, until that money's actually spent, it's not going to have any impact. So some of the numbers we heard, even though we did have a large deficit, what we heard was a little bit misleading. Secondly, there are political considerations, and those political considerations, some people may want to cut taxes, some people may want to increase spending in a recession, and we're going to have a fight over that. So political considerations are important. And then there are all kinds of constituencies who are going to fight to either increase spending, but if we are above the natural rate, they're going to fight to keep those cuts from occurring. Then there are future policy reversals, and this actually works 2 ways. Once the recession is over, or the inflation is over, then you have to change policy. This is necessary to keep us from over-expanding or over-contracting. There may be a tendency not to do this, or we may do it too soon. So future policy reversals can either come too quickly or too slowly. The other is, though, there's the offsetting state and local spending. During this last recession, even though federal government spending increased, a lot of state and local governments had to cut spending, and this offset some of the increases in spending by the federal government. Most state and local governments are required to balance their budgets, and since tax revenues had decreased, they had to reduce their spending. And therefore, what you saw were layoffs in many of those governmental units, cuts in budgets, and that offset some of the expansionary impact of the federal government. Then there's finally the crowding out effect. I alluded to this a little bit, but here I want to talk about it some more. What do we mean by the crowding out effect? Well, if we increase government spending by $1 and that reduces investment by $1 or reduces consumption by $1, we're no better off, especially if it's a reduction in investment. And how could that happen? Well, as I mentioned, there may be incentive effects, and those incentive effects can come in different forms. One is if the government undertakes things that the private sector would have done, we're simply going to move money from the private sector to the public sector, and nothing's really going to occur in terms of impact on the economy. Also, since the government is going to run a deficit, they're going to have to borrow money. What does that mean? They're going to have to go into the private markets, they're going to have to borrow money, and that is money now that private companies cannot borrow. They may drive up interest rates, or they may simply make money unavailable to private companies to invest. So again, if you increase government spending by $1, but you reduce investment by $1, you end up having no impact. Now this creates a great debate, and depending on how great you believe the crowding out effect is, some economists believe that there is really no multiplier effect, others believe it's large, and others believe it's actually negative. What about the public debt? Because if you run a deficit, now you're going to have debt. And let me explain something very simply. The public debt is an accumulation of all the money we have borrowed over the history of the country. So for instance, we run a deficit this year, that adds to the public debt. If we run a deficit next year, that adds to the public debt. If the third year we balance the budget, we don't add anything to the public debt, but on the other hand, we don't reduce it either. So who does own the public debt? Well, the argument used to go that it was owned by the people of the country, but today much of our public debt is owned by foreigners, roughly I believe 1/3. And the other question then is, what is too much? Well, that's debated, but many economists believe once public debt exceeds 70% of GDP, that is a bit of a problem. And so right now we're exceeding, our public debt exceeds a little over 100% of GDP. So is that a problem? It may well be. How do we compare to other countries? Well, again, you have to look at the countries. For instance, Japan, who has been in a recession for probably 10 to 20 years, has their public debt over 200% of their GDP. This is at least relatively one of the highest in the world, and it doesn't seem to have done them any good. Other countries, it's much lower. So how do we fare? Probably about average, or maybe a little below average, or I should say a little above average in terms of public debt. Is it a burden on future generations? Well, there are two answers to this. The first answer generally is the actual creation of the debt isn't. That deficit doesn't hurt future generations because the real price was paid by people in that current period. On the other hand, it will hurt future generations because we're going to have to pay interest on that debt. As the debt gets larger, interest payments get larger, and as interest payments get larger, they take a larger part of the federal government budget. This is going to crowd out other types of spending. Right now, interest rates are exceedingly low, but should they go back to where they have been in the past, the interest rate on the debt could basically crowd out almost all spending in the budget. This creates a serious problem. And again, what does this do? More crowding out. You know, if we're going to have to raise taxes to pay the interest rate, that means we're going to have to crowd out current consumption. So again, crowding out can be a serious problem with the public debt. In this chapter, we have discussed fiscal policy. We find that we use expansionary fiscal policy during recessions. We use contractionary fiscal policy during high inflation periods. The plan is, of course, to bring us back to the natural rate or the full employment rate without high rates of inflation. We have also discussed the shortcomings of fiscal policy, and there are some. And in the next chapter and next chapters, we are going to discuss monetary policy, which is another type of policy that can be used to combat either high unemployment or high inflation rates.